Med schools are usually the make it or break it for medical school applicants, and that's why it's really important to focus on them so that all the time and effort that you spent towards focusing on the ATAR and the UCAT don't go unwasted. Hi, I'm Archer, a first year medical student. A lot of the things that I'm going to go through in this video aren't actually talked about a lot when we're referring to how we can best prepare for the interviews. We'll firstly look at what is the interview actually looking for? What are the worst ways that we can be preparing for the interviews? And then of course, how can we be the student that the interviewer wants to give marks to? All right, let's get straight into it by talking about what the interview actually is. The purpose of the interview is to actually see if a candidate has the suitable traits for a potential medical student or doctor. In this assessment, they're looking for a completely different skill set compared to what you're tested on when you're looking at the ATAR or the UCAT. And at most universities, the interview is actually equal weighting to your ATAR and the UCAT, which basically means that 4 minutes of a 20-minute interview, which is pretty typical, is going to be worth all of the effort that you spend towards focusing on an ATAR subject. At many universities, the interview is even worth more than 33%, which just shows how important it is to focus on that, and it is actually something that can be prepared for. Let's look at the ways that you could be sabotaging your preparation that you put towards preparing for the interview. The first way that you can sabotage yourself right off the bat is by not preparing at all. The interview is something that can be definitely prepared for, and it's a no-brainer in my opinion that you would want to focus on that and prepare for it if you want to increase your chances of getting a medical school spot. And I actually quite think it's quite different to the way that you might prepare for interviews for jobs, for example. And that's rightfully so, because they actually have a specific marking criteria which tests for very particular things. The number one worst thing that you can be doing in preparing for interviews is by doing past questions from a previous year and trying to, focus all your time and energy on that, hoping that they're going to pop up the next year. Looking at a variety of questions is useful, like it is in the UCAT, but only if you're doing it in the correct way. You shouldn't be focusing just on how do you answer this specific question, but how can you develop a thinking process to answer questions of that particular type. So really, it's the same as a UCAT, and the same can be said here. You should have a thinking process for any of the question types that you might see in your interview, whether it's personally based, it's about a scenario, it has something to do with ethics. You should be prepared for it. Literally a huge majority of the questions from 1 year, for example, I'd even say 98% are not going to pop up in the next year. It's not worth memorizing the answers and rehearsing responses to previous questions, because the interviewers are just going to see straight through it, and then they know that you are ingenuine, and how are they supposed to believe anything else that you say after that? You really need to make sure that you have a way about going about answering every question. There are going to be questions that the interviewers are going to throw at you to put you off, and they're doing that specifically so they can see how you respond to those sort of scenarios. I remember in my interview at UNSW, they asked me a question about, tell us about some qualities about your friend that you dislike and why. You might think it's a really weird question to get at a med school interview, but it was a really good opportunity for me to talk about how I was aware about the weaknesses of my friend and then some of my own. It shows that I am self-aware about what I surround myself with, and I might be able to think about the things that might be holding my friend back. There is no specific answer to this question. They're really just trying to see the way that you think and justify and evaluate your reasoning for particular things. By asking these questions of you, they get much more of an insight of what kind of person you really are and see how suitable you are to being a medical doctor. That's actually the best way for them to differentiate between students. The next worst thing that you can do is give stories without context. Too often, students spend way too much time talking about a story about saying how they've learnt leadership and that they are going to be a great doctor. But in doing this, they actually waste crucial minutes instead of making good impressions on the interviewer. Speaking about stories of your own is only useful if you're able to take a step back and analyze and evaluate what you learnt from that scenario. And then of course, you actually have to link it to the question. And I think that a lot of stories that students give are just kind of irrelevant to the question itself. It actually needs to answer the question. For example, if you got a question that presented to you that you were a friend of someone who's about to go through exams and they're really stressed about that, but they also have some family issues going on at the same time, and they'd ask you, what do you do? You probably want to talk about a story where you've been in a similar scenario. That would be something that's relevant, and you'd be able to draw something from that as well to show your understanding of these particular traits, which are really useful to mention when answering this question. You talk about that experience and how you had to show empathy, right? And then you have to show your understanding of empathy itself, what it really means to you, and the importance of it in this scenario. Anyone can just make up a story, so that's not where the marks come from. They come from your ability to actually give these examples in context, but actually make them useful in a way that you're able to draw something from them to show the interviewers something more about your understanding of empathy, for example. Another thing that students often don't realize is that they're not going to ask you about what volunteering or work experience that you've done, how many awards you've won, or how many leadership positions you've actually held. They simply aren't worried about that at all. They already know that you are quite successful. From getting the interview in itself, you had to go through the ATAR, you had to go through the UCAT to get that interview in the first place. They much rather give you questions that can assess the traits that you actually have. Whether it be a question where it's presenting you a scenario where you need to show leadership, or it might be asking you for an example when you've had to work in a team. Some students try to force their achievements into their answers, but really the interviewers are just going to ignore it because they can't compare students just from the number of achievements that they have. They really have to look at students and their traits and how they compare between becoming a successful medical student. All right, let's get into how we can answer these questions in the best way possible. The first thing that I have to say is when you're presented with a question, a high scoring answer is going to be one that actually understands what the question is assessing and is able to show a diverse and unique demonstration of the actual trait. What I mean by this is you actually are able to show an authentic understanding of what empathy really means and how important it is as being a doctor. The interviewers are looking for your understanding of these traits, your beliefs, and your motivations all the time. Every question actually has a purpose in the interview. Each question that is actually presented to you in the interview is an opportunity for you to show yourself to the interviewers and your understanding of these traits. You're also able to show what it really takes to be a successful medical student and doctor. All right, we're about to go through the things that can differentiate you the most just in a minute. All right, here's a quick example of a question that you might get. It might be scenario based and they're telling you about an example where a doctor has left a scalpel inside someone after surgery. And now they've been confronted by another doctor who's seen on the x-ray that there's a metal object, but the doctor is actually refusing that he had dropped a scalpel into the person. You might then have to explain the ethical implications in this example. And if you didn't mention anything about honesty or responsibility, then you're going to get 0 marks in that whole question. And that's because you've just completely missed the point of the question if you didn't mention anything about it. I really didn't want to gamble my preparation for the interview and take zeros for questions. And that's why I went out to seek help for my interview preparation. This was made possible with iChemMed, who I actually did my UCAT preparation with. And because I had such a good time there, I actually went for them as well for the interview. And that allowed me to score interviews in each of the states that I applied. Because I really value what they have to offer, I reached out to them to see if they would kindly offer a $5 voucher for all of my students, and they said yes. So anyone who uses the coupon code ARCHER will be able to get that $5 off. This can be used for people who are interested in the interview masterclass happening this year. Also, the cost of the interview class is actually quite cheap at $370 compared to the other interview options out there. And there are only 3 streams left for Adelaide, Perth, and Melbourne. And I know that they're actually filling up quite quickly, so there actually is an online option as well, since most of the interviews happening this year are going to be online. The team that runs it is highly experienced, and that's part of the reason that I was so happy with going with them, because I was able to learn about all of the question types that popped up in all of the interviews that I was going to sit. And that's personally what I found most useful in my UCAT preparation. Since most interview offers are out, I know that these classes are actually filling up quite quickly. So if you're interested, please go check them out. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me a DM on Instagram and I'll answer it as soon as I can. Okay, so at very minimum, you want to be aware of the traits the question is actually asking you about. So first you have to actually acknowledge the trait and then dig into how it's important to you. So for example, you might be talking about honesty. It's very easy to actually list off these traits for a particular question, but it's quite difficult to show that you have a developed understanding of these traits. And that's what you really want to show to the interviewer. When a question asks you what you're going to do in a particular scenario, the stance that you take doesn't actually really matter in the end. What they're really looking for is that thinking process that we already mentioned, but what were the multiple things that you had to consider before you came to a final decision? You have to give more than just superficially answering the question. If it just asks you, what would you do in this scenario? You don't just list out the things that you would specifically do. You have to explain and justify each reason that you've given for what you've done, and that's how they get to see what kind of thinker that you actually are. And some interviewers actually will help you out a little bit, and they're being nice when they say, oh, can you let me know a little bit more about that? Because they're telling you that that is an opportunity for you to talk more about that particular trait, whether it's something about critical thinking or problem solving, for example. They want to see your problem solving skills and how you're able to come to an evidence-based decision. And that's the thing that doctors have to do all the time. That's why it's tested in the interview. Sometimes with these questions, they actually provide you an opportunity to change your answer if there's new information that comes to light, because they want to see if you're actually going to stick with your answer still with even that new piece of information, or if you're going to flip your answer because now you're able to make a more evidence-based decision that is more well-informed. It really depends on the scenario, because sometimes the decision that you made in the first place is still the best decision with the available evidence, but sometimes you might have to flip it. That's something that they really want to look for in terms of how you justify your reasoning for each thing. The final topping on the cake is if you're actually able to show how you've been developing these traits within your own life. This really shows that you have an authentic understanding of the traits that they're looking for, and that you actually have enough self-awareness to engage in lifelong learning, which is one of the really important things that doctors have to do throughout their life. And these are just two of the traits that they're looking for in the interviews out of many, many, many traits. On this channel, I'll cover more about how we can get into med school, studying, productivity, and more. If you haven't seen my video on how I kept on top of everything, keeping productive with school and everything outside of it, make sure you go check it out. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.